One of the things that's hard to comment on when it comes to television like this is when exactly decisions are made relative to the episodes actually going live. To explain what I mean by this, for those of you who don't know, spoiler alert in 3, 2, 1, Kess, Jennifer Line, will be leaving the series in exactly 7 episodes from this one. This episode and an episode just a few previous were very Kess-focused stories, and very Kess-focused episodes, which were also very widely well-received. And in both cases, they both kind of helped to contribute to a bit of foreshadowing of something that the crew of Voyager was actually planning to do. I shouldn't say the crew, excuse me. The crew who made the show were planning to do pretty soon for the season ender. Obviously, those plans were changed, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But my point is, at what point in time I find myself wondering, did they decide to finalize exactly when she would be leaving the show? Now again, I'm saving all that discussion for the gift when we get there. So I'm not really going to talk about that too much right now. It just makes me wonder, because this is a really good episode overall. Most people consider it to be one of the best Voyager episodes, period. And it's a very character-driven piece, which is all centered around Kess, with some strong character moments by Tom Paris, and her daughter, whose name I can't even remember, the guest star who played her daughter. Let's go ahead and talk about the other thing real quick here. For those of you who don't know, the original intent was they were going to have all of Season 4 be a year of hell, okay? It was, now I gotta stress this, because it was originally intended to be a year of hell, a whole season of hell, rather than a two-parter of hell, which doesn't really have the same ring to it when you think about it. And there's a lot of reasons why that didn't happen. Most of that has to do with the same problem that exists and always has been keeping Voyager down. That is to say, executives and the producers and the people who have no frickin' brains. See the previous episode, Favorite Son, for a good example of that if you don't understand what I mean. But regardless, the original intent was they were going to lead into this big Krenim thing, and they wanted to start doing actually foreshadowing because they wanted to dip their toe into what is referred to usually as string continuity. Now here's the thing, continuity has different times. I actually did a whole video just talking about continuity. To explain very simply, Babylon 5, Battlestar Galactica, Farscape, these series have string continuity. What happens in one episode immediately affects the next episode, and the episode after that, and the episode after that. Not every single episode has to do with the same overarching story arcs, but each episode that is occurring in order is affected by what happened previously. So, you know, if, I don't know, Earth blows up in one of these episodes, then in all subsequent episodes, Earth is blown up, and it's going to affect them. Now, the thing is, though, the difference between string continuity and setting continuity is string continuity is a little more tightly focused. Now, I give you examples before, but honestly, probably the single best example of string continuity is actually Season 3 of Star Trek Enterprise, which I actually recommend you watch if you haven't watched it. Season 3 and Season 4 I both recommend you watch. Not Season 1 and 2. Season 3, an episode would end, and then the next episode would literally begin like 10 minutes later. In other words, each episode was literally just that. It was an episode of an overall story arc. It was string continuity. That is the furthest extreme form of string continuity. Shows like Babylon 5 and Farscape are also string continuity. They're just a much more looser form of it. They still qualify, though. But the reason I mention this is because that's what they wanted for Year of Hell. The intent was to have each episode end, and then the next episode begins 10 minutes later. It actually sounds a lot like the Xindi arc, which is what Season 3 of Enterprise is referred to as, if you think about it. Which is funny because it's the same people who wanted to do Year of Hell wanted to do the Xindi arc, and were finally allowed to because Enterprise was bombing so badly. But at this point in time, they were told no. And then they were told, well, critical reception to Unity was terrible, so we want to go ahead and give a big action-packed Borg episode. So we got Scorpion instead, and Two-Parter of Hell was pushed back. Now, I mention this not just for your information, but to explain. I'm obviously a huge fan of continuity in general. Setting continuity, character continuity, string continuity, doesn't matter. I'm a huge fan of it. Always have been. And my reason why can always be best described as it means what happens actually matters, as opposed to it just kind of happening and then occupying 45 minutes at a time. Whether it's entertaining or not, it won't matter tomorrow. It won't matter the next week. I like consequence. I like significance. One of the biggest downsides to string continuity is demonstrated in this episode. A lot of viewers, when we saw this, they actually really had a big thematic undercurrent of the Krenim and the whole chronoton particle torpedo thing. They really helped establish a race pretty much out of nowhere, and it was pretty obvious to us when we were watching this live. It's like, okay, that means something. They're actually going to go somewhere with that, right? And eventually they did, but again, that's quite a ways from now, well into Season 4, so the fact that, well, I shouldn't say well into, but it's in Season 4, so the fact that it had no payoff initially was rather confusing to a lot of people. And that's one of the problems with string continuity. When you can't fulfill on it, when you can't actually follow up on your foreshadowing, it just ends up being empty air. And that's especially bad on a television show, because you never know when a particular actor will leave the show, for whatever reason. There's dozens of reasons for an actor to leave the show. You never know when some executive will step in and say, no, you can't do your story. You never know when someone will step down and say, we want you to do this instead. All three of these things happen to Voyager to prevent this from happening. And these things happen all the time in television. So it's really fully understandable why a lot of shows have basically shied away from the idea of string continuity. That being said, I found myself wondering what it would have been like. But so this is an episode that's really bizarre, because I'd say about half the Voyager episodes so far have had really good teasers. And a vast majority of them had good codas. Most of the episodes, even the bad episodes, have still had good codas and still enjoyable. I know I'm kind of skipping ahead here, but the coda of this episode is just bad. The teaser's great. Starting the very first thing you hear, and it's more obvious in hindsight, but the first thing you hear is we're starting the chronoton thing, and then okay, we're doing this thing, Grandma Kess, cut to credits, Very effective teaser. Definitely gets your attention, bam, right there, and you're like, okay. And the fact that temporal crap was already mentioned means okay, time-traveling story. And most of the audience could probably piece together what's going on in about 2 or 3 scenes. You get the teaser, one scene after that, and then, bam, okay, we know what's happening. That being said, that teaser was good, but why are the cast so stupid? I mean, okay, I'm skipping ahead in my notes here a bit. One of the things I like about this episode, I do like this episode, don't mistake me, but one of the things I like about it is that Kess is portrayed as sufficiently intelligent that pretty quickly she starts to figure out what's going on. Pretty much by the time she reaches the birthday, which I think has jumped like 5, she's got a good handle on what's going on. And she's already working on a solution, which is very Kess. It's very in character for her, very driven, and very, workaholic, to be blunt. So she's like, bam, I'm going to do this. And I liked that, and I liked that it took her a pretty small period of time to put pieces together and figure out what's going on. Why is it that no one else seems to be picking up on that? Why is it that everyone else, when confronted with someone who doesn't remember them and has memories of the future and constantly talks about being in a temporal stasis pod, they don't put 2 and 2 together on that one? In Star Trek, in Starfleet, for that matter, which has had more than a few dealings with time travel. Which, I'll segue into... You know what, I'll just talk about that now. This segue works. Speaking of which, there's something way further down on the line here, when Kess pulls aside Janeway and says, I need to tell you about the Krenim. Now, the thing I want to say is what Janeway says to Kess, which is to grab her and urgently say, tell me more. The Temporal Prime Directive exists for a reason, and I'll actually be talking about that at some point in the future. I don't remember when, actually. Oh, yes, I do. Never. Sorry. I'm sorry. On my stream recently, I was discussing an idea for a Star Trek show, which I actually had fully worked out and was actually going to pitch, and actually did pitch to CBS, and CBS told me to go screw myself because they weren't making a new Star Trek show. Moving along, one of the things in that, forgive me for segueing here for a moment, one of the things in that was a final real analysis on screen explaining why Starfleet sometimes does and sometimes doesn't use time travel. The idea is really simple. You only use time travel when you're, basically you have to have a convening of certain board of admirals or certain captains have to be involved, and they know that they have the ability to time travel. They have for decades, about a few centuries actually at this point. They know how to do it, they know why they can do it, they know that it's incredibly risky and incredibly dangerous and can have ridiculously bad consequences if it goes wrong. So they basically have to get together and kind of have a full consensus of, yes, okay, we're going to go ahead and time travel. Most of the exceptions have been individual captains doing it either on accident or very rare circumstances of doing it on purpose. James T. Kirk being a big example of doing it on purpose. I'm referring to Star Trek IV primarily. And so there was going to finally be this discussion about, okay, temporal prime directive and how it actually worked in application rather than just saying temporal prime directive and then paying lip service to it. I bring this up because if we are to think about such a thing, I have knowledge of the future, I want to share it with you. To most Starfleet captains would probably be something along the lines of, okay, please don't tell me that. Don't mistake this for a negative, though. Actually, I think this is a positive and one of the few times Janeway is viewed as I personally perceive Janeway as. In other words, someone who, despite being overwhelmed by her position, is ultimately a scientist and a pragmatist. And someone who realizes, okay, some knowledge of the future is something I will tolerate in this circumstance, at this time, under these conditions. Not all the time super okay with time travel, hopping around or whatever, but right here, sure. So it actually made sense for me to her to immediately leap on that and be like, okay, tell me what you know. It's a pity then that Kes would not actually be on the show when they encounter the Krenim. But again, I kind of already talked about that. Alright, so enough segues. Let's rewind back to the beginning of the episode. So, when I used to think about this episode, I usually thought of it in a bad way. It's funny the way memories work, which is kind of appropriate for this episode. But there's two big things I usually remember about this episode. And again, this is usually considered one of the better episodes of Voyager, on the top whatever lists. One is extreme awkwardness and borderline rudeness at the beginning of the episode. And the other is that terrible coda I mentioned at the end. And that's all I remember. Usually. I shouldn't say always, but usually my initial reaction to the episode is, I don't want to watch that. And then I rewatch it, and I was like, this is a really good episode. I just mentioned that because I feel like explaining a little bit. Let's just say that I have had experience with real-life people who I have had a lifetime of experience with who don't remember me. I shouldn't say a lifetime, my lifetime. They were a little older than I was. And they didn't remember me anymore, and I know what that was like, and that just kind of left a bad taste in my mouth, seeing that happen. But once I got over that hurdle, and basically from the birthday party scene and on, no issues. The rest of the episode was great. That being said, I gotta ask really quick, why are her memories just magically restored at the end of the episode? And yet she still retains her memories of the all-possible future? You know what? Let's just explain this way. This whole episode is a great example, and Star Trek does this a lot, of a really dumb idea that is executed extremely well. You take something ridiculous or stupid or something that's just like, what? And you read it on paper and it's like, no! And then you try to dissect it. If I was to actually nitpick this episode, I'd rip it apart. But I'm not. That's what I'm here for. That's not my job. I do not follow the nitpicker's prime directive. I hope at least one of you gets that. I actually own some of those books still. Point being, though, I look at this episode and I see its tremendous flaws, but it is so well executed and so well presented that it's still enjoyable. Which brings me to my main point here, and one of the reasons I really love this episode. This is a huge character piece for Kes. This is Kes really getting to show her chops. Jennifer does an amazing job of portraying a huge gamut of emotions, and again, portraying Kes, except Kes minus any of her memories. one could argue this episode actually lends a very strong leaning towards the nurture versus nature argument, because in absence of memories, she is still distinctly Kes. She still cares about people, she's still driven, she still wants to help, she still wants to work. You know. I also really liked how she slowly grew fond of Tom as she regressed back in time, right up until that wonderfully horrifying scene. You must be B'Elanna. Think about what that would have been like to her. Think about what kind of reaction that would have for her, for someone who has spent the last few days or weeks, however long it is, in her perspective of time, getting closer and closer to someone who constantly is professing his love to her. Which brings me another thing this episode does beautifully. There's a scene where Paris and Kes are together, and it is an amazing scene. There's several like that, but it's the one where they're in there and they're going over their memories, and Tom is explaining, what they've been through. And you could see that Tom is going through what a lot of us have gone through in real life. Imagine for a moment that one of the most important aspects, one of the key puzzle pieces, the bridge points, what do they call those? Cornerstones. One of the cornerstones of your life is wrong and broken. And you, as a human being, because that's what you are, except for you, are wanting to have some kind of comfort or capacity or help or aid or something to help you cope with this horrible situation. And then when the cornerstone that is broken is the person you would normally go to in order to try and fix this, when something in your life is so horribly wrong and that something is a someone, you can't go to that person anymore. And McNeil does an amazing job portraying someone who is being ripped apart internally and doing his damnedest not to show it, to try to be strong, not just for himself, but more importantly for her. Trying to maintain the strong emotional supportive front for someone who he knows needs it, even though he himself is so distraught to the point of near paralytic despair. Which brings me to my next point. This entire episode came basically out of a nightmare that the writer had. And it kind of shows, because when you really think about it, the main aspect that this episode examines from a thematics perspective is horrifying, the idea of losing memory. I actually had a dream like that myself once, where I was interacting with several people and they didn't remember me at all. They had no idea who I was. It was terrifying. Forgive me for quoting Final Fantasy IX, but to be forgotten is worse than to be dead. I am probably paraphrasing that, but whatever. And so it's a horrible thought, and it actually goes both ways, and that's why it's so terrifying, because Kes doesn't remember these things about these people, and they don't remember the things she does, because her memories are from the future and theirs are from the past. So no matter what, there's never an actual convergence between the two. How horrible would that be? The scene that really made that strike for me is when they're trying to prevent Kes from doing another temporal jump and failing. And she reaches out to Tom, the man she's grown connected to over the last few however long. And Tom reaches back, and you could just see on his face that sheer helplessness, that horror. It's also, in a really morbid way, very intellectually fascinating to me to think about that kind of cross-memory situation where you remember things, they don't remember things you remember, if you follow me. And I suppose I could also bring up the fact that, at all points in time, Kes is trying to stop her journey backwards. She finally succeeds when we reach the now, as far as when this episode should happen in the overall order of the seasons, but it makes me wonder what would have happened if she had stopped it further in the future. And I mention this because it's an idea that I've heard postulated before, the fact that they could have used this very story idea to literally do a time jump. Doing a time jump is always a dangerous thing in a show, or in a story in general, but used carefully and strategically, it can actually be very advantageous. And so literally doing a reverse time thing until they stop, say right about when right before they did that big jump, her daughter's still alive, Tom's there, they're married, and the Krenim thing is over with, stopping time there and continuing from there with the status quo fundamentally altered by the passage of 3 years or whatever. Would have been interesting. Or no, not 3 years. 6 months. Excuse me, 6 months. That would have been interesting, wouldn't it? Shoot, I'm already out of things to talk about. Oh my god, I hate this when I have so little to talk about. Okay, let's talk about a few more things here. First of all, I do find it interesting to see that Kes and Tom are the two that actually end up together, because both of them share a fairly similar character traits kit, in that both of them are rather adventurous, explorative, and very competent. I just mentioned that because, let's just say I think they go back better than Neelix and Kes ever did. That being said, I do think that B'Elanna and Tom do work very well. But then again, I think a lot of that has to do with the very honest chemistry that both of those actors have on screen. And again, that slow boil thing I've been mentioning before. Now, another thing to comment on here, to really dissect this episode. I usually talk about writing in general. I talked about the time skip and how it can be used in order to advance your plot and to fundamentally change your status quo, etc., etc. One thing I want to talk about when it comes to this episode from a writer's perspective is how careful you have to be about doing things like this. Let me explain what I mean. Okay. Time travel is the... I don't know what to call it. It's the one thing you want when it comes to writing, especially when it comes to sci-fi. Doing the great time travel stories are remembered for a long time. The bad ones, well, sometimes they're remembered, but most of the time they're forgotten as garbage. The thing is, most time travel episodes, most time travel things in general, are generally bad. And the reason why is because it's difficult to pull off time travel. It always has been. Whenever you do time travel, you have to put a tremendous amount of thought into how you're constructing it. You have to put a tremendous amount of thought into how time travel works, and then you have to make sure both of those things are staying consistent with each other and with themselves when you're actually doing it. So, to any budding writers out there, if you want to do a time travel story, you got to think about that. I'm not saying don't, but I do think this episode uses an interesting approach that only worked, however, because of the fact that the strong character emphasis worked through it. In other words, this is a bad time travel episode, if I can just be blunt, but it is a good character episode. You see the difference here? And that's the problem. If you're going to do it, you have to make it make sense to some extent or another. It can't just work out. And you can't just use alternate timelines. That is such a cop-out. Don't do that. Don't just say it's a possible future. Don't just say it's an alternate future. That is literally cheating when it comes to writing. You were literally saying, I'm not going to put effort into trying to resolve this because it doesn't matter. And you shouldn't care about it either. Understood? The only time you can pull off that kind of time travel is when you're doing something as a deliberate parody or as a comedy piece. And things have done that before. Some to success and some not. But again, Holy Grail, there we go. But time travel is very much the Holy Grail of writing, because being able to say that you did a good time travel story is a badge of honor amongst a writer, especially amongst movies and television. Now, if I was to give any hints or tips on how to actually pull that off, my personal opinion is to go ahead and write the framework of what you want to do with it, and focus on that first. Really flesh out whatever it is you want to do. Maybe there's a big plot point you want to make. Maybe there's some big thematic thing you want to do. Time Zero over in TNG had a huge thematic significance and undercurrent of fate, destiny, free will, etc. going underneath the whole thing. And that was one of the reasons why Time Zero succeeded. This episode had a strong emphasis on Kes as the character, Tom as the character, the development of the characters, and the focus on the individuals and their performances. And that's why it succeeded. So focus on something else first, then graft the time travel into that. Make the time travel work with that or for that. Because that way, at the very least, if you have a situation like this episode, it's still remembered as a good episode, even though the time travel is bleh. If you're still insistent on focusing on that time travel first, honestly, take your time on it. I know, pun. But seriously, write it out. I usually You get those big old notepads, and like, okay, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and this happens. And for God's sakes, don't do alternate timelines. Don't pull a frickin' it happened in an alternate dimension, it doesn't matter. Don't do that, okay? So I got to comment on two more things, and then I'm kind of out of stuff to talk about. I apologize. One of those things is there's a scene in this episode I can never watch without laughing anymore, thanks to Sci-Fi Debris. I try not to shout out him too much because Lord knows the man already gets way more dinner than I do. But he did a run of this episode. I haven't watched it in a while, but the one scene I remember very distinctly is it's showing her going back and back and back. And then it goes back to when she's a child, and it goes back to when she's a newborn baby. And he goes out on the voiceover, and he's like, "Chronotons! Chronotons!" And I can't watch it without laughing, and I can't watch the little baby without thinking that Kess is in there going, "Chronotons! Chronotons! I can make this work! Chronotons!" But that leads me to the one thing I would change about this episode. It's the same thing I would change about the episode whose name I suddenly can't think of early on, which was the Doctor trapped with his own delusions episode. God, what was the name of that? Yeah, whatever. They do the bait and switch with the end. All right, we figured out the solution, but they need to pad out another 3 or 4 minutes of runtime. So, oh no, it's not working. Psych, it totally worked. It's actually worse than that. It's more like, it worked. Nope, it totally didn't work. No, it actually did work. That's the reality of it. And it's cheap, and it's literally just padding. It's filler. I would have gotten rid of that, fleshed out more of anything else. You've got so much character drama going on. For God's sakes, you could have done more of the emphasis on Chakotay actually having to take command in the middle of battle because his captain just died. You could do more emphasis on Neelix trying to adjust to a life of rigidity and basically militarism when that's one of the things he had been so opposed to in his previous life. You could have focused on Tom more or Kess more because God knows this is their episodes to begin with. But no. You had to give us the bait and switch, stupid waste of crap, which I really had to restrain myself from fast-forwarding through like I normally would. So, that's it. Sorry, this is a really short episode. Good episode, though. Alan Krochner? I don't know how to pronounce that. He directed this episode, and he actually is directed... this was his first Voyager episode directing. But he does a lot of good stuff. He'll do a lot of good stuff from now on in Deep Space Nine and in Voyager. What You Leave Behind, to name one episode, is something he did. So he's got a really good touch, and he really knows how to do a unique form of... I don't know how to describe it. I can just see it in my head. What he does is he does this type of angle that really emphasizes perspective of characters rather than perspective of the viewers, if that makes any sense. And he does that a lot. He does that in most of his work, so I'll be pointing that out probably in the future, assuming I remember to do so. Regardless, I will see you yesterday when I jump back in time. Dumb joke.
B'Elanna.
I keep forgetting that you don't remember any of them. B'Elanna was someone who was very special to me. When she died, I felt like I wanted to die too. But you helped me through it. I'm sorry.
No, it's my fault. You haven't done anything wrong. It's just...
You don't remember any of our life together? No, that's all right. I've got enough feelings for both of us.